Hi. Pretty much anytime there's a discussion about Christopher Columbus, and especially on Columbus Day, there's always a few people taking it upon themselves to defend him. Lately, I've noticed that a lot of them cite a certain YouTube video. A video that purports to tell the supposed real truth about Columbus. You know, he wasn't a bad guy, it's all just a myth. He was just like any other normal guy of his time. That sort of thing. And oh my god, am I sick of being linked to this flagrant whitewash. So it's time, folks. It's time for a rebuttal to Knowing Better's video in defense of Columbus and exaggerated evil. Now yes, this is a response video, but it's also going to be much more than that. This will be an excellent historical resource on Columbus in general, since the quest to whitewash his legacy goes far beyond just a single YouTube video. I'll provide extensive evidence of his intentions, the things that he did, the legacy that he left behind, and talk about something that's way more important than all of that: what Columbus represents. We'll even go a little bit into historiography, how history is studied, and why some very common ways in which many people think about history are outdated, reductive, and sometimes even racist. I'll also explain how to spot subtle historical denialism. Not the sort where people outright say X thing never happened, but rather the kind where people present themselves as the middle ground, the rational voice of reason, while actually just whitewashing everything, making huge leaps of logic, leaving out context, doing everything they possibly can to cast doubt on the evidence, and presenting common denialist talking points as if they were simple, objective facts. Because, well, that's what Knowing Better does in this video. For real. Strap yourselves in, it's gonna be a long one. So, Knowing Better's video argues that Columbus has been given a bad rap. That everyone exaggerates the evidence against him, that people intentionally misinterpret and especially mistranslate sources to make him look bad, that they just plain fabricate stuff against him, and that overall he doesn't deserve the hate that he gets. That by the standards of the time, he just did what everyone else did and that it was all inevitable anyway. He emphasizes that in his conclusion.
Was he a bad guy? If we look at him through the historical lens, not really. He wasn't any worse than anyone else.
Oh god. But more on that later. So I think that's a fair summary of his main arguments. Just for full disclosure before I begin, this isn't going to be in perfect chronological order with his video because his video is very disjointed. He often returns to the same topic minutes later, so I had to take it out of order in order to link my segments together thematically. If you want the full context, you should watch his video first. So his thesis in the first part of the video, which argues against the idea that Columbus was some sort of unique dumbass with no idea what he was doing, is largely true. I'm not here to argue against that bit. I don't particularly care whether Columbus was a big dum-dum or a very stable genius, because being some sort of genius wouldn't somehow make up for the atrocities that he's accused of. I'm here to argue against the second part, in which Knowing Better argues that Columbus wasn't a bad person, like it says in the title. An exaggerated evil. There are nonetheless big problems with the way that Knowing Better presents this first part, and I think it reveals a lot about how he, and a lot of other people, think about history. He very much looks at things through a colonial lens, and if he has any history education, he definitely did not learn very much about methodology. Now pay attention here because Knowing Better is just one example of this. It's actually very common among people who have an interest in history but don't have a grounding in the formal study of it. So you might think like this too, and this might be a great opportunity for you to, well, think about how you think. Now here's Knowing Better.
Not because they're intellectually inferior or anything like that, but because they had a really difficult spawn point. And because of that, they hit somewhat of a cap on their civilization tech tree.
Oh my god, dude. This isn't a video game. If you look at history through the lens of video game systems, you're gonna have a very skewed view. So you might be thinking right now that that was just a joke, but this view of history is actually the basis of his argument here. You can't say that it's just a joke when he later goes and makes an argument based off that exact same logic. Human societies in real life, including in Europe itself, did not follow some binary tech tree based on a European reference point, and they definitely did not progress at varying speeds from prescribed milestone to prescribed milestone. If you judge indigenous civilizations by how far along you think they were in a tech tree, based on an idealized, European view on what achievements constitute progress, of course they're going to look less progressed. Just like if you did the same thing but the other way around. This also isn't something remotely limited to video games. In fact, there's a name for this sort of thinking in the study of history, because it's an old, discredited idea that often carries racist undertones. The law of environmental limitation of culture, that takes for granted the idea that indigenous people were less developed, and that this was due to their supposedly less fortunate surroundings. The issue with this is, firstly, that the idea that they were less developed, even by European standards, isn't true. Many indigenous peoples in the Americas had very large and sophisticated sedentary agricultural societies, complete with large cities, along with certain things and certain habits that Europe did not have. And two, what even is developed? Were Aboriginal Australians, for example, commonly cited as an example of a uniquely underdeveloped people, less developed than Europeans? Or were they actually very well adapted to their circumstances and didn't change much over time because they didn't need to, rather than because they couldn't have? These are the kinds of questions being asked by historians today, rather than just assuming that indigenous peoples were less developed because their societies didn't look like what we're used to. The answer might not be quite as easy, and might not be very conducive to helping European descended people feel superior, but it's a much better way to look at history than by just assuming that everything is just progressing along a linear path based only on what we're familiar with. Approaching this like Knowing Better does here is something that's common among many Western so-called history buffs, who like history in terms of factoids and cool stories, but are not particularly interested in how history itself is studied and practiced. If you lack this grounding, it's very easy to go straight to these sorts of simplistic, outdated ways of thinking, and to avoid thinking about how you actually think. And this video is a great example of this, as this lack of grounding underpins not only the way that Knowing Better thinks about this topic, but also the way that he researches and presents it. For example, he constantly uses the term tribe to refer to different indigenous people.
What's true for one tribe isn't necessarily true for another. If one tribe mapped all the stars and created an almanac, that doesn't mean they all did. If one tribe didn't use the wheel, that doesn't mean they all didn't.
A tribe is a subgroup. It's not a general term. Only very rarely is it used as a descriptor for an entire people or a nation. If you wouldn't use tribe to describe all the different European peoples, then why indigenous peoples? This says something about the way that he's approaching this. He's using the same sort of terminology that some colonists would offhandedly throw out in the 19th century. Not language that accurately reflects the reality of the very different types of indigenous social organization, and that would be indicative of an informed understanding of the history of the Americas. He also constantly says that Europeans discovered the Americas. And well, do I really even need to explain what's wrong with that?
Columbus's discovery, on the other hand, opened up both halves of the world to each other and changed world history forever. So I suppose he got kind of lucky that he accidentally discovered some new land.
Okay. People were already there. Discovery is also not just a very factually incorrect term to use. It's also a very loaded one. We overwhelmingly see discovery as a positive thing. Scientific discoveries like the discovery of penicillin or electricity, discoveries of archaeological artifacts, the discovery of hidden treasure, stuff like that. I mean, the most famous documentary channel ever is the Discovery Channel, which is all about instilling feelings of wonder and awe in its audience. Or at least the last time I watched it, like 20 years ago it was. Please don't ruin my childhood. So the use of that term, rather than a more accurate or neutral alternative, subtly directs us towards seeing the European arrival in the Americas as a positive thing too. The fact that Knowing Better constantly expresses this sort of sentiment in his video shows us yet again that he sees history in this sort of binary progress as I define it sort of way, and that he thinks this discovery was not a negative or even neutral thing, rather that Europeans arriving in the Americas was actually a good thing.
There are no draft animals or work or pack animals in the Americas. There are no horses, donkeys, or camels. You can't really have large cities without animals.
Okay, so the entire premise of his argument here is just wrong, even just aside from the fact that it's based on the video game tech tree view of history. Across the American continent, Animals were domesticated, notably dogs, wolves, llamas, and alpacas, and there were more animals that weren't domesticated but that could have been eventually, such as buffaloes. But either way, it's not as important as he says, because there were plenty of large settlements in the Americas, which shows that you don't actually need domesticated animals to form them. Here's some of them: Tenochtitlan and Tikal in Mexico, Cahokia and the Pueblo cities in the USA, and Cusco and Machu Picchu in Peru. Some of these cities rivaled or eclipsed the biggest in contemporary Europe, and they had some very, very efficient crops unique to the Americas, such as the potato and corn, on some very fertile ground, or spawn points in the gamer vernacular. Why is it that Europeans are framed as having all the advantages here? You can't easily judge the value of, say, the potato versus the chicken, but I think it's pretty high up there. Just ask an Irishman.
Diddly diddly date. Sure, they're only feckin' great. What's that? That was a harmful stereotype of Irish people which was popularised at the peak of anti-Irish discrimination in the UK and US. Ah, shit.
The fact that he doesn't know these things, yet still went and made a video where he confidently speaks about the history of the Americas, is indefensible. These are the basics. It's also yet another example of the tech tree mentality, since he just presumes that domesticated animals would be an absolute prerequisite for having a large settlement without checking to see if he was wrong. It takes 5 seconds to Google, my dude.
Since Europeans and Asians had been living in close proximity with animals for centuries, they had built up somewhat of an immunity to animal diseases, like cowpox, chickenpox, and the various swine and avian flus. So on Columbus's second voyage, when smallpox was introduced to the New World, it burned through the entire continent, killing 90% of the Native American population before they had even heard of a European.
The idea that smallpox was introduced to the New World during Columbus's lifetime has actually been reassessed by modern historians. The demographic historian, Massimo Livi Bacci, has written 2 recent papers on disease in the New World that assess the historiography on the topic, one of which deals specifically with disease in Hispaniola, the island that Columbus governed. He states, after extensive examinations of secondary and primary sources, that there are no historical proofs of major epidemics before the smallpox of 1518 to 19. Columbus died in 1506. The idea that there were outbreaks before that is because earlier historians were trying to find explanations for why the population of Hispaniola collapsed so long beforehand. It's a hypothesis, an attempt to fill in the gaps, one that there's absolutely no evidence for, and that's why it's a theory that's become quite unpopular in the last couple of decades. Coincidentally, this hypothesis also serves to absolve Columbus. If there was a disease outbreak, then the mass deaths of indigenous slaves, which we know happened, are magically not his fault, which is why knowing better brought it up. The fact that the population was sharply declining and that disease was not the principal cause for this means that something else was happening. And what exactly do you think it was? Okay, and this might sound crazy, but maybe it had something to do with all the massacres? Or with Columbus dislocating the indigenous people from their traditional society and economy, forcing them to instead serve the needs of the colonists through slavery? You know, stuff like that? Sure, maybe. Or maybe it was all just a big oopsie. Wouldn't that be convenient for this defense of Columbus?
This was inevitable and unavoidable.
It's interesting that the inevitable and unavoidable thing didn't happen. Sure, disease did kill a large portion of the population of the Americas, but that came later and it was a gradual process, not one that just happened in a big oopsie before Europeans ever even got to the mainland of the Americas. Hernan Cortez, for example, landed in a very, very well-populated Mexico, and that was in 1519. 13 years after Columbus died.
Before they had even heard of a European.
Disease did have a huge effect later on, but it was not immediate. Hand-waving everything away as just some unfortunate accident that happened due to disease is a classic denialist talking point. If disease was inevitable, then the deaths of indigenous people were just mere unfortunate accidents on the long path towards European-induced progress, rather than actually related to it. Here's another example of it, from far-right agitator Tucker Carlson.
The left speaks only of Columbus's genocide, mostly because his ships brought old world diseases to the New World.
Knowing better's in good company, isn't he? Historian David Stannard summarizes this mentality. By focusing almost entirely on disease, contemporary authors increasingly have created the impression that the eradication of those tens of millions of people was inadvertent, a sad but both inevitable and unintended consequence of human migration and progress. He also states that the destruction was neither inadvertent nor inevitable, but the result of microbial pestilence and purposeful genocide working in tandem. So yes, disease absolutely was a factor, but not a big one during Columbus's lifetime. But it wasn't anywhere near the only factor. And things that the Europeans did to the indigenous people also greatly increased their susceptibility to disease. They removed them from their traditional ways of living and forced them to work in cramped and terrible conditions, which made outbreaks much more devastating when the diseases did finally arrive. Sure, eventually contact would have been made, diseases would have been transmitted, but that doesn't mean that they would have spread exactly as they did, since that transmission was facilitated by the upheaval that conquest had on indigenous societies. It also doesn't mean that these hypothetical other people would have done everything as Columbus and the Spanish did.
Whether it was Columbus, any of the people who followed him, or even a Chinese explorer coming the other way.
Maybe they wouldn't have even colonized the continent. Maybe they would have instead set up trade routes and then gone home. But we can't answer these questions because it's all just hypothetical alternate history. Just like the notion of inevitability. You can't simply present all of this as inevitable. You have no idea what would have happened otherwise. Knowing better is presenting an unfalsifiable alternate history hypothesis as if it was simple fact. This primarily serves to frame Columbus and other colonists as people without agency, just along for the ride, and thus magically not responsible for their actions.
Absolved.
And that's exactly why knowing better does it. Okay, so that's the first half finally done with. God, this is gonna be a long video, isn't it? At least now we're at the actual fun part. Knowing better attempting to refute more specific accusations against Columbus. It starts out with attempts to debunk supposedly mistranslated or out of context quotes. For this part, I'm going to swap to voiceover because I'm going to be putting a whole lot of sources on the screen. Don't worry though, you'll see my beautiful face again in the conclusion. Okay, over to knowing better.
But this is something that people bring up all the time, that in his own words and in his own journals he says this or that. The most common quotes are the ones he shows. So let's start with this one about them making good servants. What do you notice about this quote? How about the fact that it's neither the beginning nor the end of the sentence? There's clearly more to it. So we're gonna have to look it up. And here it is. It appears to me that the people are ingenious and would be good servants, and I am of the opinion that they would very readily become Christians, as they appear to have no religion. They very quickly learn such words as are spoken to them. In full context, the word servant could mean slave, or servant of God, or subject of the crown. When they just cut out the ingenious good servant part, it only means slave. They remove any context and any doubt. But these are Columbus's own words. We have to take them at face value since we can't figure out what he really meant, right? Do you see where I'm going with this yet? These aren't his own words, because his real name wasn't Christopher Columbus, it was Cristoforo Colombo. Oh look, what do we have here? Yes, I really do have that kind of time on my hands. Here's what we're looking for from October 11, 1492. Now we have to translate it. Let's just shove it into Google Translate and see what we get. They must be good servants and of good wit that I see that very quickly he says everything he told them blah blah. Obviously Google isn't the best translator since it doesn't carry meaning very well, but it takes some linguistic gymnastics to get from they must be good servants and of good wit to the people are ingenious and would be good servants.
He says it takes linguistic gymnastics to get from A to B because Google Translate said something else. It apparently didn't occur to him that Google Translate might be wrong or might be using a synonym. The thing is, the translation that he's deriding here is already a literal one. Ellos deben ser buenos servidores y de buen ingenio. Literally, they must be good servants and of good ingenuity. The main difference is that the English version is just flipped around, but the meaning is the same. Google translated ingenuity to a synonym, wit, but that doesn't mean that the translation is wrong. It just means that Google chose a different word. Though the original translation that he dislikes so much is actually more accurate than Google's because it translates ingenio literally. How is that the absolute worst? It carries the same meaning no matter how you slice it, even in the translation that Google gave him. I can't believe what I'm watching. How could he possibly frame this as a dishonest translation? Did 80,000 people really buy this? My head hurts.
But there is another one people like to refer to. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I please. Here's the Spanish, and here's what Google Translate says. Because with 50 men, they are all subjugated, and it will make them do everything they want? Okay, that ending doesn't really make all that much sense, but I can tell you what it doesn't say. Conquer them and govern them as I please.
Okay, this one is especially bad. The original Spanish here literally translates as, because with 50 men, they would all be subjugated, and I will do with them whatever I want. Versus, I could conquer them with 50 men and govern them as I please. The meaning carried there is pretty much exactly the same. The second one is just a bit stylized because, you know, literal translations are really boring. You can take stylistic liberties as long as the overall meaning is the same, which it is here, because subjugate means to bring under domination, especially by conquest. So the original is, funnily enough, actually worse than just conquer on its own, as subjugation implies not just conquest, but an intention to dominate afterwards. And govern them as I please means pretty much the same thing as make them do whatever I want. So both sentences mean the same damn thing. This is someone wholly unfamiliar with the practice of translation trying to frame people as dishonestly smearing Columbus with intentionally malice translations, when the translations clearly carry the same meaning as the original. Even Google Translate is giving him translations that say more or less the same thing, which he seems not to notice.
But I can tell you what it doesn't say. Conquer them and govern them as I please.
When I first watched this, I couldn't believe that he was trying to present these translations as dishonest, because it's really obvious that they're just saying the same thing, even if you don't speak Spanish. But now I get it. He does it because this video is based on the premise that Columbus was just a poor, regular, everyday, normal guy who's being unfairly derided, so he has to pretend that translations that are actually very accurate were manipulated to make him look bad. If the smear campaign that he invented never existed because, you know, Columbus has actually been presented as some sort of superhuman hero of European civilization, the whole premise sort of falls apart.
Again, in full context, in this section, Columbus is asking the king and queen what they want done with the natives.
He's not so much asking there, he's suggesting. He's just writing in the way that you write to a king and queen. You know, he can't directly tell them what to do because they're a king and a queen. He has to write in a submissive manner. In those days, that's just how you spoke to people who had authority over you, and especially literal monarchs. But he really has all the power to get what he wants here. He's their eyes, their most important representative in the Americas. They don't see what he sees, they interpret all of this through him. He has the power to present them with whatever view he wishes of the places and the people that he sees, so he's consciously trying to direct them into doing what he wants. No one forced him to immediately jump to, hey, these guys are so weak, I could totally conquer them and enslave them. Haha, you know, if you wanted me to, that is. Wink wink, nudge nudge. He did it because he wants them to give him permission to do so.
Suggesting that 50 men would be all that's required to hold the island.
I'm not sure where he got to hold the island from. There's nothing there about holding the island. In the previous sentence, he's talking about keeping them captive on the island, then immediately jumps to talking about how easy it would be to subjugate them. It's clear what he's suggesting. Historian Halil Suad Badisho also analysed these exact passages. He says, the first recommendation of Columbus reflects his predisposition to the Portuguese practice of plunder and enslavement of the natives along the coast of Africa, and all arguments, specific and symbolic, marshalled by Columbus, led to the conclusion that the natives must be enslaved. It's generally a good idea to take a look at what modern historians have to say, rather than just interpreting things ourselves in the most biased way we possibly can.
Encomienda was the Spanish feudal system of lords and peasants, and that's what the natives were, peasants, not slaves. They were forced to work against their will, but nobody owned them. Nobody could buy or sell them.
The Encomienda in the New World was not the same as the Encomienda in the Spanish feudal system, and saying that it was is very much another whitewash. This is actually an extremely important thing to discuss in relation to Columbus's legacy, because the Encomienda system, which under Columbus was called the Repartimiento, was implemented by Columbus, and it established the basis of socio-economic relations between indigenous people and the Spanish for centuries afterwards. Of the many things that he did, this probably had the most long-lasting negative effect. Historians Ronald Batchelder and Nicolas Sanchez state that the American version of the Encomienda originated in Hispaniola when Columbus assigned repartimientos, or distributions of Indians, to the original settlers to provide labor services for them. So Columbus, as governor, introduced this system. He was the authority who awarded people encomiendas and who oversaw them. What was an encomienda? Well, it was an entitlement to forced labor by indigenous people. The encomendero, the holder of the encomienda, did not technically own the workers, but they were forced to work for them nonetheless. During Columbus's time as governor, encomenderos had no official obligations towards their Indian workers. Such laws were only implemented after Columbus was gone. For the welfare of the indigenous people, this was actually worse than traditional models of slavery, because the encomienda slaves were not an investment of the encomendero. They lost nothing if the slaves died. They'd just be replaced with others at no cost. Economic historian Timothy Yeager puts this rather coldly, saying that the encomienda depleted more quickly the stock of native labor than regular slavery would have. That's a euphemism for more natives died. And Justo L. Gonzalez, another historian because that's who we cite in videos on history, summarizes it like so: the encomienda was even worse than outright slavery. That is not just a system of feudal subjects being given the protection of a lord, as Knowing Better tried to frame it. It's absolutely slavery by any reasonable measure, and I don't think the people being forced to work literally to death really care about the distinction of whether or not they're directly owned by the person subjugating them or not. And quite frankly, neither do I. Going for a gotcha on the technical meaning of a word doesn't change the fact that this institution, implemented by Columbus himself, was one of the most brutal and callous forms of forced labor that the world has ever seen, at the very least as bad as the worst examples of slavery. This system was formalized under his successor, because by then it had already been entrenched by Columbus. After that, it was exported to other Spanish colonies in the Americas and adopted by the Crown as its official economic policy. Columbus was the root of all of this. And guess what? The implementation under Columbus specifically, which he made no efforts to regulate, was so brutal that even his contemporaries noticed. Bartolomé de las Casas, mentioned in the video, is only one of them. Even the Spanish monarchs themselves noticed. And in 1512 they implemented the laws of Burgos, which regulated the treatment of natives under the encomienda system. Now these laws were mostly ignored, but the fact that they were implemented shows that the system implemented by Columbus was hardly normal. In reality, it was actually seen as especially cruel and in need of reform. So now we're about to see the part of the video where the burning desire to reach as far as possible to frame Columbus as positively as possible is most evident. The whitewashing is pretty damn extreme in these next sentences. Get your goggles on.
Columbus wanted to subjugate them, which means turn them into subjects of the crown, not enslave them.
What? Who here has ever in their life seen the word subjugate used to literally mean make someone my subject? That is some impressive
Linguistic gymnastics.
But okay, let's entertain this. Let's look at some context and then we can decide what Columbus meant. Here's some facts for you. Columbus negotiated a deal with the Spanish crown whereby he would be given 10% of the profits from the lands he discovered forever. About a decade before his voyage to the Americas, Columbus made a living in the early Portuguese triangle trade, 1/3 of which was the slave trade. He became accustomed to the slave markets of Genoa and had visited the slave trading ports of Portuguese Guinea, such as La Mina in present-day Ghana, where he saw the Portuguese model of African slavery firsthand. This inspired him in his ventures in the Americas. From the very beginning, the slave trade was a crucial part of his economic plans. In 1493, in the very first letter Columbus wrote after returning from his first voyage, he wrote to the royal comptroller, promising them as many slaves as their majesties ordered to make. Unprompted, by the way. No one had asked him for slaves, he brought it up by himself. And yes, he used the word slaves directly. not subjects or anything else that could be twisted in any other way.
Not enslave them.
Early in his second voyage, in 1494, Columbus captured, imprisoned, and then shipped dozens of indigenous Carib people back to Spain with a letter to the Queen. In it, he wrote, "May your highness judge whether they ought to be captured, for I believe we could take many of the males every year and an infinite number of women." Quite clearly, he was sending them back as examples of slaves, and offering the king and queen the opportunity to ask for more. Again, unprompted. Columbus almost obsessively tried to push the Spanish crown towards the slave trade in these very early days of Spanish colonization. We're not talking him just following orders, we're talking him constantly suggesting it and trying to sell them on it because he wanted his 10% cut. We also have further evidence that he was familiar with the African slave trade from earlier in his life, because in that same letter, he makes direct comparisons to African slaves. He wrote that one of them would be worth more than 3 black slaves from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from those I am shipping out now. Want another example? Well, here's another quote from a letter he wrote 10 days later, suggesting that the crown pay for provisions with slaves that he would send them. "We could pay for all of that with slaves from among these cannibals, a people very savage and suitable for the purpose, and well made, and of very good intelligence." And yes, he specifically uses the word slave. Again, he does that a lot actually, just not in the couple of quotes that Knowing Better cherry-picked. This is the context in which we have to read Columbus's earlier comments on the ingenuity of the indigenous people who he met. He saw them as commodities. He was not just complimenting them for the sake of it, he was assessing their worth as forced laborers. Knowing Better is really big on intent. He lets us know that in a bizarre, incredibly out of place rant about how George Zimmerman was innocent of murdering Trayvon Martin. No, not in another video, in this video.
In 2012, George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. That fact is beyond dispute, but he was found innocent. How is that possible? Because he was tried for murder, not manslaughter. Murder requires an intent to kill. Zimmerman didn't leave his house that morning saying, "I'm gonna kill a black kid today."
Yup, in this video about Columbus, there is a random tangent justifying the murder of Trayvon Martin. So, in light of all this context, with Columbus establishing a system of slavery somehow more brutal than the chattel system, and his evident enthusiasm for establishing the slave trade in the Americas, did Columbus intend to make indigenous people his subjects, as in the Spanish feudal system? No, he intended to subjugate them. You know, the literal meaning of his words. Now you might be thinking, damn, that's some good research, putting all of those primary sources together to form a clear path of progression from Columbus being inspired by the Portuguese slave trade that he saw earlier in his life, to him later trying to push it incessantly in his capacity as governor. Thanks, but it's not my work. I paraphrased all of that from a few pages of the book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, by Mexican historian Dr. Andres Reséndez. I used the footnotes that he provided to track down the primary sources in the original Spanish, just to make sure that he and I couldn't be accused of taking part in the non-existent conspiracy to mistranslate Columbus. You see, there's no reason for me to go and do my own extensive primary source research just for a YouTube video, because people who are experts in the historical method, and also in this specific subject, have already gone through the painstaking work of doing that. They've pieced them all together to provide tons of context, to explain not just what Columbus did, but why he did it. Ignoring the work of modern historians who instead make baseless speculations is indicative of something. That these secondary sources make Columbus look very, very bad. And well, Knowing Better was trying to make Columbus look as not bad as possible, so he avoided them entirely. Instead, he just found a couple of quotes and then lied about what they say while hoping the viewer wouldn't notice. Well, I noticed.
All we have are transcriptions of his journal written by someone who's probably already been mentioned in the comments below. Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas was a noble who was given an encomienda in the New World. In 1515, Las Casas gave up his encomienda and advocated instead for the use of African slaves. That's right, the protector of the natives, as he would later be called, advocated for the transatlantic slave trade, which then started under Nicolas de Ovando, not Columbus.
The Columbus apologism is really evident in the fact that knowing better feels a need to attack Bartolomé de las Casas, whom he seems to perceive as someone who gets too much praise, while poor old Columbus just gets hate, so old Bart here needs to be brought down a notch. And that's because the existence of people like de las Casas, who spoke up against the treatment of indigenous people, is very inconvenient to the narrative of Columbus as just a guy who was doing what anyone else also would have done. Clearly, there were people who weren't like Columbus, who spoke out against this system, who might have done things very differently if they had been the ones in power, showing us that his idea of Columbus as merely the guy who happened to be in charge, doing the stuff that everyone else surely would have done in his position, is absolute garbage. And de las Casas was not alone by any means. He was not the first to voice such opinions, nor was he the last. Many people agreed with him, and many others were swayed by voices such as his. In his attempt to smear de las Casas for the sake of whitewashing Columbus, knowing better of course doesn't mention that later on he came to see all slavery as immoral and advocated against it. Again, because the fact that in the early 16th century, abolitionism of both Native American and African slavery already existed in the Spanish Empire is very inconvenient when you're trying to paint a monster as just a normal everyday guy. Anyway, while we're on the theme of the transatlantic slave trade, which Knowing Better graciously brought up for us, do you know who was the first guy to ever transport shipments of slaves across the Atlantic? It was Christopher Columbus. He wasn't just the first either. He was also the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. He shipped indigenous slaves from the Caribbean to Spain 5 times in 6 years, which is just about as much as he possibly could have in such a short period of time, considering the length and difficulty of the journey. So that further demonstrates his enthusiasm for the slave trade. The first, as mentioned earlier, was a shipment of a few dozen slaves that he sent, unprompted, with a letter offering more. The second, in 1495, was a much larger shipment, the first ever large-scale movement of slaves across the Atlantic. He had intended to ship 1,600, but he could only manage to cram 550 into the 4 ships that he had available. Many of those who couldn't be loaded were instead given to the Europeans in the colony as slaves, showing that there was, actually, regular ownership-style slavery in the colony alongside the Encomienda system. 200 of them died during the trip. Resendez writes that, with this voyage, Columbus inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates commonly associated with African slavery. The third, in 1496, was a shipment of 300 slaves. The fourth, in 1498, was a shipment of 800 slaves. The fifth, in 1499, was a shipment of 300 slaves again. That's about 2,000 slaves in 5 years. He did not simply suggest a brutal system of forced labor that was worse than slavery. He did not just try very hard to push the slave trade, he put it all into practice of his own accord. He not only established the Encomienda system of slavery in the Americas, but he was also the first ever transatlantic slave trader. He laid the groundwork for the African slave trade. He showed that large amounts of people could be crammed into ship hulls and hauled across the ocean. Is that enough intent for you? Sued Badisho summarizes it in better words than mine. In the bill of indictment of that long and terrible history of servility and slavery in the capitalist world system, Columbus has the distinction of being the first to introduce that new order to the Americas. Columbus was not some guy in the grey area just doing what was normal for his time. He came up with the idea and implemented it. He made it normal. But even still, it took a while to catch on, because even Columbus's contemporaries were a bit squeamish about his obsessive promotion of the indigenous slave trade. Catholic law dictated that only prisoners from just wars could be enslaved. Columbus was breaking this law, meaning that, quite literally, it was not a norm. Even his contemporaries noticed this. In 1500, shortly after the arrival of Columbus's last shipment of slaves, a decree from the king and queen freed all Indian slaves, prohibited any more from being taken, and mandated that any who wanted to return to the Caribbean be given passage back. So even the king and queen of Spain, who were undoubtedly pretty damn awful people themselves, seem to not have been quite as comfortable with the indigenous slave trade as Columbus was. So even by the standards of his time, he was considered extreme.
But it was while he was arrested that he wrote an important letter.
Girls as young as 9 years old were sold into sexual slavery.
My customers wanted New World sex slaves, and I heard them.
Actual Christopher Columbus quote.
That actual Christopher Columbus quote comes from that important letter I just mentioned, where he complains about the robbing and sexual slavery of natives, which is why he cut off colonists' hands and noses.
So Columbus cut off colonists' hands and noses for taking sex slaves. What's the source for this? Nothing? You made it up? Unsurprisingly, yup, he did. He invented a justification out of thin air. That's how strong his desire to absolve Columbus is. What did Columbus actually do and why, according to contemporary primary sources? Luckily, we have an authoritative one. A document by Francisco de Bobadilla, who had been tasked by the Crown to investigate allegations that Columbus was running the colony as a tyrant. He interviewed both people sympathetic to and opposed to Columbus and wrote a 46-page report. This document is not available online, but historians who've seen the original have given us a nice summary. One man caught stealing corn, had his nose and ears cut off, was placed in shackles and was then auctioned off as a slave. A woman who dared to suggest that Columbus was of lowly birth was punished by his brother, who had also travelled to the Caribbean. She was stripped naked and paraded around the colony on the back of a mule. His brother ordered that her tongue be cut out, and Christopher congratulated him for defending the family. And just in case anyone wants to do the whole thing of, oh, that's everyone being unfair to poor old Christopher Columbus thing again, the historian who assessed the document, Consuelo Varela, who is an expert on Christopher Columbus in particular, said, even those who loved him had to admit the atrocities that had taken place. Columbus and his brothers come across in the text as tyrants. Now one can understand why he was sacked, and we can see that there were good reasons for doing so. So that's why he was removed from his governorship and imprisoned. That's why he cut off people's hands. He was not defending girls from sex slavery. Knowing better literally made that up. And what this also reveals is that Columbus was not just a normal authority of his time. Because even by the standards of 15th century Spanish colonists, he was a tyrant. And if he treated the colonists that badly, we can be sure that he was much, much worse to the indigenous people, because we know that he saw them as nothing more than commodities.
And that the violence of the calumny of turbulent persons has injured me more than my services have profited me, which is a bad example for the present and the future. Am I saying that Columbus was a good person? No. But am I saying that he was against the very thing that people say he was for? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yes. They're quoting his complaint about something happening and saying he was doing it. That's... talk about taking something out of context.
So, knowing better is once again taking a giant leap to misconstrue what this quote is saying, while claiming, again, to actually be the one giving it context. Let's look at it. It's a letter that Columbus wrote to defend himself in 1500, after he was arrested and stripped of his governorship. He says, "The violence of the calumny of turbulent persons has injured me more than my services have profited me." The violence of the calumny means the violence of the slander. That's what calumny means. The turbulent persons refers to those denouncing his governmentship in the colony. And the last bit is him saying that the negative effects of this alleged slander on him outweighs the profits that he gained in his time as governor. This quote is a general statement. It has little to do with the previous passage. He's not even remotely denouncing the slavery of young girls. He's complaining about what people said about him and claiming that this made his work as governor not worthwhile. So what about the prior passage? Well, in this passage, Columbus is making dry observations about the island's economy under his authority. He complains that the extension of justice, meaning, those pesky laws, and the monarch's increasing authority over the colony has kept him down, basically complaining that he wasn't allowed to be even more of a tyrant than we already know that he was. Then he talks about the island's economy in dry, descriptive terms. They've found a lot of gold, so much so that within the island's economy, people have started debating whether robbery is more profitable than gold mining. He then illustrates this inflation by choosing two commodities as examples: farmland and little girls aged 9 to 10, saying that they basically fit the same price. Yes, he listed little girls in dry economic terms. This is something that was happening under his governorship, under what we've established was his tyrannical control. If he cared about the practice, he could have stopped it, but he did far from that. He instead used little girls as a point of economic reference. Quite clearly, for him this was, at best, something that he had no issue with. How on earth do you possibly construe that as Columbus denouncing the practice? He does nothing even close to the sort. The links that knowing better goes to pull something positive about Columbus out of nowhere are seriously extreme. But hey, why don't we look for some of that context and see if maybe there's anything else out there about Columbus and indigenous females? Well, good thing I went and found some. In 1493, Columbus took 10 indigenous women from Puerto Rico. Soon after, his men also kidnapped more women from the island of Santa Cruz. Columbus didn't seem to mind that at all. In 1495, his friend, Michele de Cuneo, who was in charge of transporting Columbus's first large-scale slave shipment, received from him a gift, a beautiful Carib girl. Do you think that Columbus gave his friend this girl to take nice and good care of, as I imagine knowing better would probably try to say if he read this passage? Or maybe for other reasons? In 1496, he stopped on the island of Guadalupe, where he kidnapped 2 indigenous women. In 1498, he stopped on the coast of Paria and did the same thing once more. And that's just what we know about. The sources that we have hardly paint a complete picture of everything that Columbus did. Considering that he made quite a habit of kidnapping females specifically, it's likely that he did it much more than just the 5 times that were written about. So what's more likely here in light of all of that context? That Columbus gave a damn about the trade in little girls that he mentioned in that quote, which there's no evidence for? Or that Columbus partook in it himself, which there's quite a bit of evidence for? Knowing Better's standard of evidence for his own statements is literally nothing. Knowing Better's video is an excellent example of how easy it is to dupe passive viewers. It has so many glaring issues where he just says that things mean what they obviously don't, but not many people picked up on them because they're just accepting what he says rather than thinking critically about it. It's important to be an active viewer. If someone says that 2 translations mean different things, pause the video for a second and think about whether they're really that different. If there's a web page or a quote being cited, pause and check that it actually says what they say it does, and that it doesn't contradict them. If there's a sentence or some words that you don't quite grasp the meaning of, and you're being told what they mean with no citation, pause the video and take some time to absorb it all yourself. And if you're still having trouble, open another tab and do some googling. The issue here is that knowing better is flagrantly lying, but most viewers simply aren't paying enough attention to realize it. It's understandable since, it's just a YouTube video, people don't really want to give those their full attention. Just some suggestions.
In 1530, he transcribed Columbus's journals, and then in 1542, he wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which is the thing that a lot of people point to as Las Casas saying Columbus was evil. He only mentions Columbus once, and it's rather neutral, really.
Bruh. Las Casas mentions Columbus hundreds of times. He wrote more than just one book, and he also used more than one name for Columbus. He often also calls him the Admiral. Apparently, knowing better didn't think to check his other works. Is that too much to ask from a guy who presents himself as an authority on the topic, who's presenting the real truth, the red pill on Columbus? Here's an example from the book History of the Indies, where De las Casas calls Columbus the Admiral. Considering the justification and counsel that the Admiral had given to the monarchs for war against these peaceful people, who lived on these lands without offending anyone, at the very least it seems that we should question that justice or injustice. But only the Admiral was believed, and since nobody spoke for the Indians, their side of the justice or injustice was not considered. They remained judged as criminals from the beginning, and they were destroyed until they were all gone. without anyone feeling for their deaths or taking it as a crime. So there you have De las Casas explicitly linking the destruction of the indigenous population of Hispaniola to Columbus. For him, Columbus was the first authority to try to justify war against them, which set a precedent which remained until they were all gone. Hardly
Rather neutral, really.
De las Casas wrote a whole lot more on Columbus, but I think that quote already says enough, really.
And there's yet another aspect to this that I want to bring up. None of Columbus's original journals survive. All we have are transcriptions of his journal written by someone who's probably already been mentioned in the comments below. Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas had already given up his Encomienda and started the slave trade by the time he transcribed Columbus's journals. So at this point, he has every incentive to make Columbus look as bad as possible. In fact, it's common knowledge that he paraphrased and exaggerated.
So this part is absolutely bizarre. It's conspiracy theory territory. The idea that even Columbus's journals themselves have been altered to make him look bad. This comes out of nowhere. It doesn't even make sense because in his own writing, De las Casas makes it clear that he admired Columbus and writes that he was sent by God to discover the Americas. I mean, it's ridiculous actually, just listen. The time of the marvelous and merciful wonders of God had arrived, when God chose the divine and high master among the sons of Adam, who at that time was still on earth, the illustrious and great
Columbus,
who should be known primarily for his name and his work in the colony, and for his work, his virtue, his ingenuity, his industriousness. It was one of the most divine blessings that, in the present century, he wanted to do this in his world. So yeah, you trying to tell me that guy was biased against Columbus and purposefully doctored his diaries to make him look bad? I don't think so. The opposite is much more likely, actually. I'm not the only one to have noticed that De las Casas was biased towards Columbus either. Sued Badillo said that Las Casas used Columbus's poor education and intelligence many times in attempting to exonerate him of his misdeeds and shifted the responsibility to others. So yeah, I think I've made my point there. Anyway, we often don't have the original copy of such documents, so we do work with a lot of transcriptions. This is very common, it's nothing unusual. Compared to many other transcriptions, the transcriptions that we have of Columbus's journals are actually very contemporaneous. And they're completely consistent with the things that he says and other stuff that he wrote, such as the many letters that I referenced earlier. You know, this journal only covers August 1492 to March 1493. A whole lot of stuff happened after that, and most of the worst things that Columbus wrote aren't from his journal. But if you only watch Knowing Better's video, you'd think the diary was the only document we have that Columbus himself wrote, and it really seems like he was intentionally trying to paint that picture. He conveniently ignores the dozens of others that came later that show that no one needed to make Columbus look worse than he made himself look. And anyway, you know what makes his journals a credible source? They've been cited by thousands of historians. Historians who, of course, already had this whole debate over the veracity of Columbus's journals. 80 years ago, in 1939, historian Samuel Eliot Morison definitively proved that it was a faithful transcription. He concluded that the few people saying otherwise were doing so dishonestly, just because some of the things that it says were inconvenient for their arguments. Sounds kind of similar to someone. Can't quite put my finger on it. So, do we trust the thousands of historians who have no qualms at all quoting the diaries as Columbus's own words, who clearly think they meet the standards of historical evidence? Or do we trust the YouTube man trying his hardest to instill doubt in his quest to whitewash Columbus? I think I'll go with the former. So, Knowing Better conjured his own conspiracy theory to try and manipulate the viewer into doubting whether what he presents as the only credible evidence against Columbus can even be trusted or not. That's going in very, very deep.
This is made even worse by Black Legend, which is a propaganda campaign by English historians to make the Spanish look much worse than they really were.
So, what is the Black Legend? Well, as the Wikipedia page that he put on the screen says, it is an alleged bias against Spain. He seems to miss the bit where it's not actually accepted as fact as he presented it. The Black Legend alleges that Spain's history is painted as worse than it really was, while the accusers themselves ignore similar atrocities in their own history. It is not a propaganda campaign by English historians. That makes it sound like some organized, ongoing effort of pompous tea-sipping Oxbridge historians to make Spain and Columbus look bad. The alleged Black Legend is about the British historically focusing on Spanish colonial atrocities while conveniently ignoring their own. Keyword, historically. It's not a thing today. This was in the context of a time when the Spanish and British empires still actually existed and were rivals. And so there were supposedly geopolitical motivations behind it. That hasn't been the case for quite a while, to say the least. Historians have long moved past this sort of thinking, and guess what? The claims that were once derided as the Black Legend hold true. The Spanish colonization still looks absolutely incredibly awful, and with every new primary source document that historians discover, Columbus himself actually looks even worse than he did before, as I think I've thoroughly demonstrated in this video by citing a whole lot of them. The only true part of the Black Legend is the bit about how the British focus on Spain as a way to avoid discussing their own colonial atrocities. But that doesn't mean the Spanish atrocities never happened or are less worthy of condemnation. It just means that the Brits were misdirecting, something that Knowing Better seems to enjoy doing too. And just for good measure, the two principal works that I've cited up until this point were written by a Mexican historian and a Puerto Rican one. So much for the British propaganda campaign. There's only one type of person left who seriously complains about the so-called Black Legend today. Well, other than Knowing Better, that is. These guys. Know who they are? Far-right Spanish nationalists. That flag they have there? It's the flag of Franco's Spain. The only people who seriously believe that the Black Legend is a thing today are far-right Spanish Empire apologists. Great company to be in, huh? They've got their own version of it too, called the White Legend, where they ignore inconvenient sources and take things out of context to try and paint the Spanish Empire in as positive a light as possible. Which is what Knowing Better has done for this entire video with Columbus. How fitting that he ends up complaining about the supposed Black Legend too. And guess what? In the Wikipedia article that Knowing Better cites, it says all of this already. It says, as part of what Spanish nationalists have called the Black Legend. So he knew exactly whose talking points he was parroting, and did it anyway. So at this point, it's fair to say that Knowing Better is engaging in historical denialism. Because historical denialism is more than just people outright saying X thing never happened. It has more insidious and common forms, where denialists do everything possible to cast doubt on the established facts while feigning an aura of objectivity. He does this in this video many times. He does it in presenting the Black Legend as if it was some sort of established, ongoing propaganda campaign, something that only hardcore historical denialists do today. He does it with his baseless conspiracy theory that casts doubt on the veracity of Columbus's journal, presenting it as if it were the only primary source there is that Columbus himself wrote, and implying that it was probably altered to smear him, without presenting the viewer with the fact that De las Casas was, in reality, biased in favor of Columbus. He does it by inventing instances of other people mistranslating Columbus, while making the most ridiculous leaps of translation and logic to get to his own interpretations. I mean, he attempts to present Columbus, a man who transported 2,000 people across the Atlantic to be sold into slavery, and who implemented a system of slavery in the Americas that was even worse than chattel slavery, as not guilty of being a slaver with nothing but semantics. He does it by accusing others of taking Columbus out of context, when in a video titled A Defense of Columbus, he somehow manages to avoid presenting the viewer with any modern academic secondary source, focusing instead on easy targets like a dumb Adam Ruins Everything cartoon and a guy in cosplay giving a TED talk or something, rather than looking at the work of academic historians. This gives his viewer the impression that if he can just refute those videos, which he doesn't really do a very good job of by the way, that means Columbus is absolved. No mention of the mass slavery under his governorship, of the slave trade, of his view of people as commodities, of how many people he killed, of his kidnapping of women. And he also did it in his random pause to attack De las Casas, something that he did not just because De las Casas, even with his bias towards Columbus, is a damning primary source on how Columbus treated indigenous Americans, but also because his vocal advocacy for indigenous rights is proof that even among rich and powerful people of the time, the way that Columbus treated the native people was hardly a given. Very inconvenient when you're trying to paint Columbus as someone who just did what anyone else would have done. Between all of this and the general vibe of the earlier parts of his video, where he frames the discovery as some sort of inevitable positive leap forward for humanity, he's pulling out all the most common talking points of pro-Spanish Empire far-right nationalists. And shamelessly so. Even the Wikipedia articles that he cites note that these are their talking points. I mean, just look at this. When he tries to delegitimize Las Casas, he puts a Wikipedia article on screen that clearly says, "Opposition to De las Casas reached its climax with Spanish right-wing nationalist historians constructing a pro-Spanish white legend, arguing that the Spanish Empire was benevolent and just, and denying any adverse effects of Spanish colonialism. Spanish pro-imperial historians depicted De las Casas as a madman, describing him as a paranoiac and monomaniac given to exaggeration, and as a traitor to his own nation." Knowing better even saw fit to highlight the talking points of these right-wing nationalist denialists. He knew exactly what he was doing. So yeah, this is historical denialism, plain and simple. Quite funny that the guy has his own videos on historical denialism.
Columbus's regime was so senselessly brutal that by 1542, the Taino population on the island had fallen to 200.
As we've already established, Columbus's regime only lasted until 1500. Adam is attributing an entire 50-year span to one person, 42 of which weren't even under Columbus. Do you even remember who the president was 42 years ago?
Why focus so much on it being a 50-year time span? Why not ask the question of, how many of those dead did Columbus kill? You can't just refute one dumb argument and then act like Columbus is absolved. You have to actually look at the evidence yourself. So let's do it. It's obvious, even though we don't have exact population figures from when Columbus was governor, that his extremely brutal practices that I discussed earlier would have resulted in a sharp population decline. Again, we don't quite have exact figures from Columbus's time, but we do have one official census from 1514, which allows us to calculate how fast the population had declined, even before the first major disease outbreak in 1518. It says that 25,000 native people were alive in 1514. So let's be generous and take a very, very low-end estimate of the pre-Columbus population of Hispaniola. Now, I could easily go with figures of more than 1 million or even up to 8 million, but I'll go with the lowball from the video.
Here, Adam says that the Taino population in 1492 was 250,000, which is pretty accurate to what most everyone else says.
250,000. From 250,000 to 25,000. That's a decline of 90% in 22 years. 7 of them with Columbus in charge. So how about we be fair and split the 225,000 missing indigenous people in proportion to his years of governance? So that would mean that we could reasonably claim, from the best statistics that we have, that Columbus was responsible for about 70,000 deaths on Hispaniola alone. That's about as nice as I could possibly be to Columbus. I'm using a low estimate. I'm assuming that he was only responsible for a nice, even portion of deaths, and that he bears zero responsibility for anyone who died as a result of the groundwork he laid after he was sacked as governor. And he still killed 70,000 people. And just for good measure, a little fragment he wrote that shows how little he valued the lives of indigenous people. While they die now, it won't always be this way. The blacks and the Canary Islanders also died at first. That's in a letter to the Queen, trying once again to sell her on the slave trade. He's saying, okay, sure, so the slaves might die en masse during the journey and in Spain, but that's okay, because eventually they'll survive. But for now, let's keep at it. Let them keep dying. Knowing better, later goes on another long rant trying to absolve Columbus on a technicality. It wasn't genocide, okay? Look at this technical definition in the UN Genocide Convention. Columbus wasn't so bad after all.
But when trying to label the crime as genocide, we have to look at the intent. Genocide, as defined by the UN, is an act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Columbus's intent was not to
wipe them out. all of them.
Dude, who cares? If you kill 10,000, 20,000, or 70,000 people, not even considering what guilt he might also bear for the legacy of the systems that he implemented, that's well past the point where whatever label you put on it ceases to matter. There's so many ways in which I could more directly deal with his attempted trap, but why bother? It's another attempt to absolve Columbus through semantics, to get us fixated on these worthless technicalities. Knowing better does this all the time. From his bizarre George Zimmerman interjection, to his technical definition of slavery, and now his technical definition of genocide, while leaving out crucial evidence against Columbus. It's a manipulative word game. If we're busy debating semantics, then we're less likely to ask questions about what Columbus actually did. And just to address one thing that I'm sure will come up in the comments, yes, Columbus is responsible for those deaths. He was the highest authority in the Spanish Americas for its first 7 years. He ruled as a tyrant and did basically whatever he wanted until 1500. Whatever resulted in these deaths was his fault, because they, at the very least, stemmed from systems and practices that he both implemented and oversaw, and especially considering his callous disregard for the lives of indigenous people. Like any other tyrant, what happened under his rule is directly attributable to him. All the big bad guys in history didn't personally kill all their victims or individually order their deaths themselves, but they still bear the responsibility. So I'm not being unfair to Columbus here at all, I'm merely applying the same standard of responsibility to him as we do to every other leader in history.
Was Columbus a good guy? No. Was he a bad guy? If we look at him through the historical lens, not really.
The idea of Columbus as a normal dude of his time is thorough garbage. It's a common refrain that's used is pervasive far beyond just Columbus, used when people want to just turn their brains off and absolve anyone of anything ever. Like, okay, if you want to say that, say, someone who held prejudiced views without acting on them was a product of their time, sure. But a murderer of 70,000 and a mass slaver goes well beyond that point.
Not really, he wasn't any worse than anyone else.
He wasn't worse than anyone else? Really? Okay, so during early contact, Columbus himself notes that the indigenous peoples themselves were incredibly open, welcoming, generous, sharing, and practically ignorant of war, yet he still immediately saw them as little more than commodities. They approached contact in the exact opposite way than how Columbus chose to. What he did was a choice. People like de las Casas existed, and they had the complete opposite mentality, advocating for the very people that Columbus saw as little more than expendable commodities. The Spanish monarchs issued a decree specifically directed against Columbus that outlawed the Native American slave trade that he was hell-bent on spreading, showing that even other evil people considered Columbus to be extreme. They also soon passed laws against the mistreatment of indigenous people, showing that there were more than enough influential people that did not actually consider his brutal slave driving and trading normal, since the empire had to at least pay lip service to changing its approach. And worst of all, this idiotic statement ignores that the vast majority of people were commoners, who I'm sure never killed or enslaved anyone. And for that matter, I'm sure that most other people never did either. You can't just ignore the vast majority of people who ever lived while trying to claim that a mass murdering slaver was just like anyone else. This is just another in the long list of knowing better's attempts to reduce the severity of Columbus's atrocities in the mind of the viewer, while continuing to present himself as a neutral voice of reason. Because the only possible way to defend what Columbus did is the baseless assertion, taken entirely for granted, that it was all just normal. Columbus was not just a normal guy of his time, he was not just a normal guy of any time. It was not normal to invade foreign lands, to subjugate the people you find there, to deprive them of their culture, to force them into slavery in a system that was worse than chattel, force them to give you tribute, try your hardest to start a new slave trade, kidnap women to be sex slaves, to kill 70,000 people, or to rule as a brutal tyrant who tortured people seemingly for fun.
De Ovando was objectively worse, Cortez and the other conquistadors were objectively worse, and the US government, most of the time anyway, was objectively worse.
Were the two other names that he mentioned here worse? Maybe, I mean, he presented no evidence. Cortez, at least, imported Columbus's Encomienda slavery system to Mexico, so it's very easy to tie the two together. Columbus directly influenced how the native people were treated for centuries, and that's just one example of how. But regardless, it really doesn't matter who's worse because it wouldn't prove anything. Was the US government worse? I mean, yeah, sure, but it's not exactly fair to compare an entire government to one guy anyway. Still doesn't change a thing though. If a few other individuals also killed more than the 70,000 that Columbus did, or enslaved more than the hundreds of thousands that Columbus did, that changes nothing. They wouldn't be anything close to the normal people of their times either. All of them would be ridiculously evil. None of that absolves Columbus. This part though is kind of ridiculous.
But even more than that, all of the unnamed soldiers under these people were the absolute worst.
I mean, I somehow doubt that a rank-and-file soldier, even the worst one ever, being as evil as they possibly could do near as much evil during their entire lives as Columbus did in a mere 7 years. There's some big shoes to fill there. They'd need to kill about 2 people a day for 100 years, and that's not even mentioning the slavery. So was Columbus a unique evil? No, but he's certainly high up there as an incredibly evil person by the standards of any time. Why does he need to be some sort of unique level of evil, the absolute worst ever, before knowing better thinks it's okay for us to deride him? Why should he be given credit for being the first European to happen across the Americas, as knowing better says?
To many people, Columbus deserves none of the credit for discovering America, but all of the blame for what happened to it.
But not be equally derided for being the first European to mass oppress, enslave, and murder American peoples. We celebrate firsts all the time. First man on the moon, first US president, first to invent something, first to achieve some feat, first European to land in the Americas. Yet denouncing Columbus for being the first to do many terrible things and thus being representative of those things is somehow super dumb and worthy of an epic YouTube debunk? There's no answer to those questions that isn't just an exercise in mental gymnastics. For knowing better, unless you can prove that Columbus is literally the worst person to ever have lived, it's somehow irrational to hate on him. But obviously that's not how things work. We're allowed to hate incredibly evil people even if they're not quite number one, and especially if they set the precedent for what came later.
But odds are you probably think,
he got lost coming here, and he's the one that named us Indians because he thought he was in India.
But conversely, I also disagree with just renaming it Indigenous Peoples Day, because what is it really?
Yeah, Columbus.
Christopher Columbus.
That's a big you.
It's just anti-Columbus Day. Think about it, what do people do on Indigenous Peoples Day? If we can pin 400 years of awful history onto one guy, it shifts all of the guilt for what happened to the Native Americans away from the rest of us. Well, the rest of you, because my relatives didn't come over until after the close of the Indian Wars, so not me.
So these people in the clip that he plays as an example in this video are Native Americans. Are they attacking Columbus to absolve themselves of their own guilt? What about, say, all the other indigenous people leading the charge against an absolutely abominable human being who is symbolic of every terrible atrocity that happened to their people? Just why might they be saying such terrible, mean words about poor, old Cristobal Colon? Question for the ages. Big head scratcher there.
Columbus is just one part, the first part, but a relatively small part in what happened to the Native Americans. So why do people hate Columbus? Or rather, why do people want to hate Columbus?
Took the words right out of my mouth. It's time to talk about symbolism, which is incredibly important to the position of the people that knowing better is arguing against, and which he totally ignores. Except at one point, when it was convenient for him, he went on a long tirade about how important Columbus is as a symbol of colonialism.
Truth is that Columbus and his imagined female goddess form Columbia have been part of the American story since the beginning. Here she is telling you to ration food during World War I, and here she is in the painting that you all know, even if you're not American, as the depiction of manifest destiny.
Do you see all of that? Columbus as the personification of the genocidal manifest destiny ideology, the personification of US patriotism itself in those propaganda posters, and thousands of places, including an entire country, bearing his name. How do you go down that list and still somehow miss the point? There's way more than that even. There's statues of Columbus literally everywhere in the Americas and Europe. Spain, the colonizer itself, holds its national day on the day that Columbus landed in the Americas. I mean, its name literally translates as the national celebration of Spain. The day is also a national holiday across much of the Americas, not just the USA. His face has been on plenty of historical Spanish banknotes. Kids participate in plays acting out the glory of his deeds. Look, I could go on, but you get the point. All of this serves to perpetuate the incredibly pervasive myth of Columbus as an incredible navigator, a noble explorer, who brought our superior European civilization to the savage, barbaric Americas. So not only is Columbus the symbol of colonialism in the Americas, who has been promoted as such for centuries, seriously, nothing else even comes close, but he's also one of the greatest symbols of white supremacy, of the idea that European subjugation of indigenous American peoples was a good thing that brought progress, or in knowing better terms, Columbus discovered America, which finally allowed the natives to progress along the tech tree rather than being limited by their spawn point, which in turn justifies the continued status quo of Anglo-European socio-cultural dominance. It's the primary school view of Columbus that he references earlier in his video.
You might think that he was a brave explorer who proved the world was round and by doing so discovered the United States, and if that's the case, congratulations on graduating from elementary school.
But the thing is, that's not just the elementary school view. It's been instilled not just in every single education system across the Americas, but also through much wider efforts to promote the myth of Columbus. You know, like all that stuff that we just went over. I mean, here's a statement from the President of the United States of America perpetuating it. After a perilous 2-month journey across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean, Christopher Columbus landed in what is today the Bahamas. This watershed voyage ushered in the age of exploration, changing the course of history and setting the foundation for development of our nation. Today we commemorate this great explorer, whose courage, skill, and drive for discovery are at the core of the American spirit. And this isn't just a thing in the USA at all. Narratives about Columbus like this have been used to instill the colonial ideology across the Americas. And they've had the exact same debates about Columbus too. For example, in 2010, Argentina renamed their version of Columbus Day the extremely on-the-nose Day of the Race. Hey, at least they didn't lie about what it's really about, unlike certain other countries. And in 2013, they had their very own controversy over a Columbus statue being replaced. It was located right outside their version of the White House. Just to give you an idea of how symbolically important Columbus has always been to colonialism, even way down south. All of this, the reassessment of Columbus across the Americas, as well as the people insulting Columbus that knowing better strawmans in his video, is not just pushback against Columbus the man. It's most importantly pushback against Columbus as the most important symbol of white supremacy and colonialism in the Americas. By pushing back against this, they're pushing back against what he represents. The colonial social order that upheld his image for centuries, and that his image has in turn helped to uphold. Yet instead of stopping to think about this for a second, knowing better just goes full, actually, and treats his opponents, even indigenous people themselves, as moronic simpletons, irrationally attacking Columbus due to their ignorance of historical facts, rather than because he is the most important symbol of colonial ideology. Again, sounding eerily like Tucker Carlson.
Ignorance of the past isn't simply tolerated, it's required. Does your average protester know anything about Christopher Columbus?
Yeah, some people in this pushback against Columbus as a positive symbol of colonialism might exaggerate what he did personally. So what? He was still 100% terribly evil himself, far beyond the point where anyone trying to correct whatever minor inaccuracies there may be, and failing miserably, could possibly have sincere motivations. Not Columbus himself, nor what he represents, merit any defense. So here's a better question than knowing betters. Why do people hate Columbus so much? Why do people feel the need to react so strongly to the very recent reassessments of Columbus and his incredibly pervasive legacy? Why make a 28-minute video where you whitewash history?
Columbus wanted to subjugate them, which means turn them into subjects of the crown, not enslave them. So on Columbus's second voyage, when smallpox was introduced to the New World, it burned through the entire continent, killing 90% of the Native American population.
Use historical denialist talking points.
This is made even worse by Black Legend, which is a propaganda campaign by English historians to make the Spanish look much worse than they really were.
And do everything possible to obfuscate and sow doubt in the evidence.
They picked the absolute worst, most biased translation to quote as journal entries literally from him. So at this point, he has every incentive to make Columbus look as bad as possible. In fact, it's common knowledge that he paraphrased and exaggerated.
Why push back against the pushback? There's only one answer to that. For the first time since colonization, Anglo-European perspectives, culture, and domination are beginning to make room for others. The Americas are finally being Americanized. Europeanness, which for centuries has dominated the continent, is being slowly absorbed into a greater whole, in which it will one day be a mere part, equal rather than hegemonic. The rapid surge in popularity of these relatively new indigenous reassessments of the legend of Columbus, the most sacred of the colonial sacred cows, settler colonialism made man, is most emblematic of these changes. Knowing better and those like him, regardless of how much they might try to hide it behind, "Oh, Columbus wasn't even that important, I don't care about him even though I made a 28-minute video defending him," regardless of whether they're even conscious of it, they see it. And it scares them. But there's no need to be afraid, my friends. Embrace it. You're a part of it, after all. Oh my god, that was long! So I basically worked on this video for like 10 hours a day for the last 2 weeks, because unfortunately it takes about 10 times more effort to debunk this stuff than it does to just make it up. So anyway, if you somehow got this far, and you like this video, why not subscribe and check out some of the rest of my content? Or if you really want to reward me for the ridiculous work that this video took, you could consider supporting me on Patreon or sending me a tip on Ko-fi. Now I'd just like to thank all my $10 plus patrons, who are now eternally immortalized in the credits of this incredibly long video. Key to the Fields, Self-Critical Marxist-Leninist, Tonga Porutu Neha, Leftist Tech Support, Amelia Sixus, Industrial Robot, Nico, Kira B, Violet Rain, Shantanav, Audrey and Nate Fawn, Cincione Bresgal, Jilly Bean, Lautaro, and Matt. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Bye!